Hello, Sean here again, and this is Bond in Context, Part 15, where we look at the historical context of the James Bond movies. We're now up to the film The Living Daylights, released in 1987, and we're on our fourth actor as James Bond, moving into the brief tenure of Timothy Dalton, where I think our discussion has to begin. I think Dalton's portrayal of Bond is highly underrated. In terms of credentials and experience, Dalton is probably the performer who brings the most to the table of any of the actors. Classically trained, appearing primarily in stage productions in Britain, he generally did film only as a sideline until fairly late in his career. Furthermore, his portrayal of Bond is about 20 years ahead of its time. In a radical departure from Roger Moore, who always played Bond with a touch of humor, Dalton's portrayal is grim, almost humorless, and tough as nails. In the opening minutes of The Living Daylights, where he's assigned to shoot a presumed KGB sniper who's aiming at a defector, we see not the dashing rogue of Sean Connery or the suave clown of Roger Moore, but a bitter, angry, and disillusioned man who hates his life, hates his job, but doesn't know how to do anything else. Dalton's Bond is basically a glorified hitman. Not only is that exactly how Ian Fleming originally wrote the character in the novels, but it's largely how Daniel Craig would approach the role 20 years later. And Craig, who, as you may recall, was a tough sell to audiences at first, has since been lauded for his portrayal of Bond. As has happened before in the casting of James Bond, Dalton was not the producer's first choice. After A View to a Kill, it was pretty clear that Roger Moore was not going to come back. I mean, my God, could you imagine him doing another one? So the casting sweepstakes was on again. Frontrunners included Sam Neill, who's now most famous for the Jurassic Park films and The Hunt for Red October, and an Irish-born actor whose star was rising in the mid-'80s, one Pierce Brosnan. Brosnan's odyssey with the super spy goes back to 1980, during the making of For Your Eyes Only. You may remember I mentioned him in my video about that movie, because at that time he was married to Cassandra Harris, the actress who portrays Countess Liesel in that film. Brosnan was on the set visiting his wife when he met Eon Productions producer Albert Broccoli. Brosnan's career hit an upswing not long after when he was cast as the Private Eye show, cast as the lead in the Private Eye show on American television, Remington Steele. I used to watch Remington Steele religiously in the 80s, and it was obvious from very early on that the show was basically an extended audition for the role of James Bond. Indeed, it seemed like the stars were aligning to hand him the role on a silver platter. In 1985, Moore retired or was let go, in the words of Cubby Broccoli. Then, at the end of the 1985-86 television season, NBC canceled Remington Steele due to the declining ratings, just in time for Brosnan to take on the role as The Living Daylights was just starting production. Then the worst thing happened for Pierce Brosnan. He got the part. Broccoli offered it to him, and suddenly the news hit that Remington Steele was going to be the new James Bond. Everybody started watching Remington Steele again. NBC reversed its cancellation, and because Brosnan was under contract to that series, he couldn't leave to do The Living Daylights. So the producers then turned to Timothy Dalton. Supposedly, Dalton wasn't that enthusiastic about taking the role. But nevertheless, Dalton's tenure as Bond is probably the most distinguished of any of the actors. Excluding Lazenby, who only did one, all the other actors have had both hits and misses, good films and bad films. But both of Dalton's films, The Living Daylights and License to Kill, are extremely strong entries in the series. So he can truthfully say, and the only actor who played Bond who can truthfully say, that he never did a bad Bond film. Politically and culturally, in 1986 and 87, the 80s were becoming decidedly less chaotic. 1987, the year the film came out, was the year of Margaret Thatcher's third election as British Prime Minister, the first PM to pull off a hat trick, believe it or not, since 1820. Economies had stabilized, The Americans and Soviets were sitting at the peace table. There was a sense that the Cold War was moderating, although there was as yet no hint of the momentous changes that were coming in the Soviet bloc in 1989. Despite this, The Living Daylights is presented as a pretty straightforward Cold War thriller. Aside from the pre-credits sequence, which is whose job is mostly to introduce Dalton as Bond, the picture opens with a scenario right out of a John le Carré novel. Bond is assigned to shoot a KGB sniper who's expected to take a pot shot at a Soviet general who is defecting in Bratislava in what used to be Czechoslovakia. This is a very literal adaptation of the Ian Fleming short story, The Living Daylights, and it's the whole sequence is shot almost like the classic Cold War thriller, The Third Man from 1949. Darkness, rain, wet streets, etc. The Living Daylights finally feels like a bona fide spy movie, very much unlike the camp fantasies of the 1970s and some of the 1980s movies, especially the last one. Dalton is much better for this material, as he's pretty humorless. As far as serious interpretations of Bond go, The Living Daylights is one of the most pure films in the series. Also very topical, the film has a subtext involving arms dealers. The chief villain of the picture, Brad Whitaker, played very well by character actor Joe Don Baker, who would reappear in the Pierce Brosnan era. He's an international arms dealer who will sell to all comers regardless of ideology. Significant public attention was focused on the international arms trade in the mid to late 1980s. In the fall of 1986, as The Living Daylights was in production, a scandal broke wide open in the Ronald Reagan White House. It was revealed that Reagan had attempted to bribe the Iranian government to intervene to cause the release of several American hostages who were being held in Lebanon, in some cases for years. The bribe was in the form of several arms deals, whose proceeds were then diverted to a secret fund to support a group of anti-communist guerrillas called the Contras, who were then fighting a brushfire war against the Soviet-backed government of Nicaragua. The Contras were one of Ronald Reagan's pet obsessions, but the U.S. Congress, which was then controlled by Democrats, had forbidden him by law to give any military aid to this group, largely because they were heavily connected to drug trafficking, a theme that will come up in the next Bond film, License to Kill. The Iran-Contra scandal, as it came to be known, was probably the most serious political scandal in recent history, even more so than Watergate, even though it did not end with the resignation of the president. It definitely focused attention on arms and the arms trade, and The Living Daylights makes excellent use of this public interest. We also have to talk about another issue that came up earlier in the series, Afghanistan. I talked a little bit about the history of Afghanistan in the 1970s and 1980s in the video on Octopussy. So if you haven't seen that video, you should probably go back and watch it. In The Living Daylights, the Soviet war in Afghanistan is a backdrop to the action occurring in the second half of the film. The plot involves the arms dealer, Whitaker, and his Soviet military contact, who's the guy who was supposedly defecting earlier in the film. And they're using the down payment for an arms deal to buy raw opium in Afghanistan, so supposedly they can turn an even bigger profit. The drug deal, which Bond interferes with, is described as the biggest deal since the Russian invasion. It is true that as Afghanistan's legitimate economy was largely destroyed by warfare beginning in 1978, it's true that opium and drug traffic became its major economic activity. And even today, even after the United States has been at war in Afghanistan for 17 years and counting, Afghanistan's drug trade is as robust as ever. The Living Daylights shows us Bond teaming up with the Afghan resistance, called the Mujahideen, who fought a guerrilla war against the Soviets throughout the 1980s. Western countries did give considerable assistance and arms, there's the arms dealing again, to the Mujahideen. Famously, Al-Qaeda founder Osama bin Laden, who later masterminded the September 11th attacks, turned up in Afghanistan fighting with the Mujahideen in 1987. It's accepted as almost an item of faith that American meddling in the Soviet-Afghan war helped create Osama bin Laden, or even that bin Laden was directly funded by the CIA or other American interests. As ironic as that conclusion would be, considering that bin Laden and Afghanistan were eventually the genesis of 9/11, it's actually not true. Osama bin Laden was not funded by the CIA, and if you study his background and his history, actually the suggestion that he was funded directly by American interests really doesn't make a lot of sense. Bin Laden was from one of the richest families in the world, and he had an extensive fundraising network of his own throughout the Islamic world, so he didn't need American money. And in any event, he was ideologically opposed to cooperating with the United States, which he saw as an even bigger villain than the Soviet Union. If you doubt me, then I suggest you read this book, The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright, which won a Pulitzer Prize and which deals heavily with bin Laden and his history, fighting in Afghanistan just before he founded Al-Qaeda in 1988. This is a great book, and it also has an additional fringe benefit. This book is to 9/11 truthers what kryptonite is to Superman. Although it's not about conspiracy theories, the exhaustive background story of the 9/11 attacks and their relationship to what was going on in Afghanistan makes very clear just how silly the 9/11 inside job nonsense really is. Anyway, I digress. My basic point is that what was happening in Afghanistan in the 1980s and eventually the 1990s is extraordinarily complicated and extremely pivotal to how world events would eventually unfold. The Living Daylights does nothing more than dip a toe into these waters, but it really is fascinating to see a Bond film that engages with the history that was going on around it. The Living Daylights is a great film, one of the best ever in the Bond franchise in my view, and as far as history buffs are concerned, there's a great deal to unpack here. Things will get even more interesting as we turn to the next film, Dalton's Last, License to Kill. So join me in that video, and if you like this one, please give it a thumbs up if you're so inclined. Thank you.